what do you think inclusive learning entails?
Not all learning takes place in the classroom. Learning is much broader than that.
Our society is often not built to accommodate those with disabilities.
Only through critical thinking and questioning, and it's the questions that we ask, can we move forward as a society?
How do you think our school can leverage other tools to create a more belonging and more inclusive?
Yeah, I think this is another thing that one wants to move towards. Young people connect and associate themselves with stories, identify much more easily with the stories of other young people because who are like themselves in many ways.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Shiv Nadar School podcast. I'm Madhav Badhwar, an IBDP2 student at the Shiv Nadar School Noida Campus. And today I have here with me Mr. Barry Vendel. Mr. Barry is the president of the International Association for Intercultural Education and serves as a consultant to the EU.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's my first time in India, so I'm very happy to be here.
It's very nice for me to meet you as well. So, Mr. Barry, as a student, I've often heard about inclusive learning as a concept, but I'd like to know more about your perspective. So what do you think inclusive learning entails?
Inclusive learning or inclusive education, one has to remember that I think in most places on the planet, and especially if you go back into history, if you look at the way classrooms were structured, we're talking about a period of about 150 years, that's about it, where you had this kind of mass education that you see in today's world, that you had a number of students sitting in the classroom, all with their hands folded, listening to a teacher. The role of the students was to listen to what the teacher had to say and to absorb that knowledge that the teacher had. And it was basically the teacher focused on those students in the classroom that had the best opportunities, the students that were the most motivated to learn, and the students that could succeed according to what the teacher thought was given by the ministry or given by the educational authorities, and would follow that path. A realization occurred, of course, among many. Some teachers already knew this, some people at ministries already knew this, other educational authorities, that not all the students were reaching their full potential. And I think that's something that especially the United Nations has been focusing on, which brings together ministries of education from all over the world. And this also happens at the EU level, where I'm a part of a working group that consists of all kinds of ministries of education. That there's something that's not quite right, that there are a lot of students that fail, or a lot of students that they might not even fail, but they don't really reach their full potential, that can do a lot more. There's a lot more knowledge there. There's a lot more skills there that are never recognized. So the task, I think, of education is to try to also reach those students that might not have the same opportunities as the students that come from better educated parents, higher economic status backgrounds, students that are really motivated to learn according to what the teachers want and to what the school wants, according to what is in the curriculum. So therefore, inclusive education, that concept itself started as a concept where it was especially students with disabilities. What happened with those students is they would be ignored, oftentimes sitting in the back of the classroom, right? And I think the awareness has grown. These students can better reach their full potential if they are integrated into the regular educational system, meaning that they sit in the class with other students. All of us have certain weaknesses. All of us have some kind of a disability in some way. The key is how to work with that. Now, that's traditionally inclusive education, is bringing in those and integrating them into the school. And that's what the core, I think, of inclusive education today. It's not only in the formal education setting. Schools that are really successful with that kind of integration don't only do this across subject areas, but also in the informal learning that takes place and the non-formal learning. Informal learning is learning that takes place in the cafeteria, learning that takes place in the hallways, and the interactions that students have in the school. That can also be influenced, but also non-formal, meaning the extracurricular activities that happen in schools. So you have around the planet, you have things like Amnesty International after group schools, where students focus on human rights issues and human rights violations across the planet. That is where some informal learning takes place. So this is where also some of that inclusive learning can take place.
So as you mentioned, our society is often not built to accommodate those with disabilities in mind. And a curriculum in terms of education is a very important part of that. So, how do you think our school can leverage other tools to create a more belonging and more
Yeah, I
inclusive
think this is another
environment?
thing that one wants to move towards. It's a matter of awareness. It's a matter of training for teachers, but also for the students to deal with that kind of diversity that one might find in a school. Too often see, I think, unfortunately, is things like bullying that takes place, and in these days, cyberbullying. Online bullying. So there need to be good anti-bullying policies that get put in place in schools. And not just the policies, but they have to be adhered to. Many students suffer from bullying in different ways. Also, bullies themselves suffer when they bully. It has a real impact on their personality. So putting that in place, putting the mechanisms in place that can prevent this kind of bullying from taking place. So prevention is key. That's one aspect. And the other thing is coping with it when it does happen. And as students feel empowered to talk about that, to go to the appropriate authorities in the schools. But then you're looking at the different subject areas. Now we know, for instance, that if you look at the history curriculum in any country, anywhere you go, it tends to be the history of the majority that's presented. There are so many unwritten histories that are out there. And many young people who are in schools come from these different backgrounds, like I said, religious or cultural, historically underprivileged communities. Their histories are oftentimes not there. In order to get them motivated to learn, in order to get them to recognize in the curriculum, in their school, their own histories, the histories of their families, of their communities, it's, I think, important that schools pay a little more attention to those histories as well. And that can be done in different ways. We have a tremendous advantage today in the 21st century that we can go online, that we can find these histories by Googling them, and more, thank goodness, more and more information is out there of these unwritten histories that can be brought into the classroom. Projects that involve the parents in the learning process, meaning students go and interview their parents, interview their relatives, interview their grandparents about what they remember about the past. Those kinds of projects, or even having students interview each other's parents, is even more interesting sometimes, especially students from different backgrounds. I'll give you an example. There's a great project in right now that's in trouble a little bit in Israel and Palestine traditionally, where they have Palestinian youth interviewing Israeli Jewish parents and Israeli Jewish students interviewing Palestinian parents. They learn about each other's histories. They learn about each other's fears as well, their aspirations, their hopes, and they come back together again in school and they discuss this with each other. So the Palestinian students talk about what the Israeli parents have said, and the Israeli students talk about what the Palestinian students have said. It's enlightening for them because they have no idea about these kinds of things. So in general, in society and in schools, we know about the dominant narrative. We know about what the majority thinks, but we so seldom know about what minority groups and underprivileged communities, what their histories are and what they think, and to hear their voices is really important. So that's one thing that can be done in history education. It's a really critical subject area, but this can be done across the curriculum in different subject areas as well.
So, I'd say one way I've been able to explore the histories of my community, the community of the rural community in a sense,
Yes.
is through project-based learning, which as an IB student, I've been involved in a lot of project-based learning through my CAS. I have a CAS project called Project Hifazat, where we aim to promote menstrual and sexual well-being in rural areas. So through its awareness campaigns and health camps, I've been able to talk a lot with just the people who attend these health camps, the rural community, which I would have never been able to meet before. And I've been able to learn their histories, the way of their life, the things they are taught, and the things they learn from their society. And also, I'd say in our classroom, we try to utilize collaborative and project-based learning in which we come together and try to find a subject-based solution for a global issue. How do you think this can be used further for more inclusive learning?
I think you're already benching a couple of things. I think it's a fantastic project to do this. One needs to realize that first of all, not all learning takes place in the classroom. Learning is much broader than that. Working collaboratively, doing cooperative learning is a challenge in a certain way, but one needs to realize that traditionally this did not happen very often, that it usually was the teacher lecturing to the student having a book and reading in the book and taking a test. But more and more, what you're seeing is collaborative or cooperative learning where students work together on projects. These are also skills that are lifelong when you learn how to collaborate with others. It means learning how to negotiate with others, how to resolve conflicts, which is really important. These are the skills that you need lifelong. So that's the first thing to be said, that this is very important, that it's happening in this school, I believe, and in many other schools that they're turning to this. There are challenges with that, of course. The teachers have to let go in a certain way, allowing the students to take the lead. Cooperative learning really gives that opportunity, if it's done well, for all the students to have a voice, to really learn the kind of skills that are needed to be a leader, to be a facilitator in a group, to be able to then take notes, to make presentations. These are skills that you will always need. It allows us to create a more equitable education and even the playing field for them. Then bringing them into the project learning aspect is not just saying there is one truth, because there are multiple truths. And there's a concept in social psychology called tolerance for ambiguity, meaning things that are not always clear. There's not always one answer. There's not always one truth. These are ambiguous, and we have to become resilient. We all have to, as human beings, become resilient to the chaos that's out there in a certain way and try to make sense of that chaos. It's also part of being human, trying to make sense of things, trying to find meaning in things. And when we do the project-based learning, it means that we're working towards something together, if it's cooperative, but we're trying to find answers to the important questions that are sometimes even more important than the answers. And it's the process, right, that takes place. That's the critical part. So asking the right questions, the process that takes place, and finding the answers. And by the way, there might be different answers for different people as well, but at least we know more in a certain way than we knew before. And in the next round of learning, let's put it that way, we are better able to ask these kinds of informed questions as we move forward. Now, the kind of work that you are doing, and I think that we're seeing more of this with service learning. Service learning in some countries, I think it came originally out of the United States, the concept of service learning, but you're now seeing in different parts of the world, is that schools are not separate from the community. Too often they are separate entities. Many schools don't want they call it interference of the parents, the interference of the community, thinking whatever happens to school stays in the school. We don't want that kind of involvement of the parents in the community. More and more, I think the realization is rising that schools, students, especially students who come from privileged backgrounds, have a responsibility. All students have a responsibility towards the community and the community towards the students. But part of that, the start of that responsibility towards the community and towards the future of the community, because they are the future of the community, is learning about the community that they live in. Many of us don't even know about the community that we're living in. So giving them the task, especially to understand the different dynamics that exist in the community, those people that need assistance, those people that need help, those unwritten histories I was telling you about in the community, getting the students involved in that, because let's face it, students are younger, they have more energy than somebody who's 80 years old. So giving them some sense of responsibility in terms of their learning to learn about and work with the community and trying to answer some of the needs of the community, answer some of the questions of the community. And that is done with the parents, with the grandparents, with the community at large. Yes, it takes more work, but it's also much more rewarding when that does take place. And it also involves the parents in what's happening in the school. Many parents, if you look across the globe, and I work across the globe, are unaware of what's happening in the school, are unaware of what's happening in their kids' education. They can't always be blamed for that because they're busy, they're working, they have other things they need to do, they prioritize them. So they don't always know. So it has to be sometimes done very explicitly, where the school, the teachers, give an assignment to the students, whether that's through service learning or some other way. Let's now explore our own environment. I do some work called Memory Walk, where we look at the monuments, because most communities have monuments in their communities that tell certain stories. There are also monuments in the community that don't exist. Certain histories, unwritten histories, oftentimes don't have monuments. So it's important for young people to understand where those monuments came from, what they represent, what kind of histories they represent, why are they important to the community, but maybe also why they might be controversial, because one of the critical things about education is to learn critically, to think about things critically, because only through critical thinking and questioning, and it's the questions that we ask, can we move forward as a society. And one of those starting points is looking at these monuments in the environment and interrogating, we call it interrogating these monuments, and also asking parents, grandparents, others in the community, do you remember when this was created? What does this monument mean to you? Because oftentimes we just walk right by them, but they were put there for a certain reason, right? And like I said, not all these histories are positive either. So it's just getting a better understanding of one's community. Much of the service learning kind of work happens in homes for the elderly, happening in institutions where you might have individuals or have some kind of a disability as well. So trying to help out where they can. They're oftentimes understaffed. They need the help. They want the help. They want students to be involved. Yes, that takes a certain amount of negotiation. Yes, that's not always easy, but it's very beneficial. And I think that probably in your own work, you probably learn more doing that kind of work than you learn from any book you ever read in your life. So it's such a, because also when you're reading a book, you don't necessarily question who you are. You're not negotiating your identity as much as when you go into the community and you start having these conversations with people and you start understanding where they're from and start understanding their fears, their hopes, their dreams. When you do that, it gets you to reflect more on who you are yourself and on your responsibilities as an adult in society in the future.
You have had extensive experience in international teacher education, right? As you've been working, or you have had worked at the Anne Frank House for a very long time. So how do you say this has shaped your perspective on inclusive learning?
Yeah, 27 years at the Anne Frank House was a long time. I think we have to go back to why I was attracted to working for the Anne Frank House. For me personally, when I heard for the first time about the Anne Frank House and I read her diary about the experiences that Anne Frank had, and of course her diary is widely read around the world and it's one of the most famous books anywhere, I related to a few things that Anne Frank wrote about. And that was especially her sense of exclusion, because I felt very excluded at the age of almost 14 coming into the Netherlands, not speaking the language. And I related to that. And I think that's the strength of the diary of Anne Frank, that she, in her story, really appeals to anybody, and that's almost everybody, by the way, who at some point has felt excluded, and in whatever way that was. And I think that's what appeals to people, the sense of exclusion. And for others, depending on their background, people come from minority communities, they feel a sense of persecution. And she was persecuted. And she was persecuted only and excluded only because of who she was born as. She was born as a German Jew. And because of being Jewish, she was excluded. And this, anybody across the globe, and this is why it's such a powerful story, can connect to that they are sometimes excluded because of who they are, and not because of the choices they make, and not because of their political persuasion, but purely because of who they are. Working with that particular issue of the story of Anne Frank, which is, like I said, a very powerful story, and it means something different to everybody in different ways. But and working a lot of different countries with that, I realized, number one, that these kinds of personal testimonies and listening to the voices of young people by other young people really has a huge impact. She's seen as inspirational. She's seen as inspirational because she was able to write so well. Unfortunately, she was killed, but she was able to write very well, and that is seen as very inspirational in itself. Being able to express your feelings on paper or maybe these days on the internet, I think is a very powerful message for young people today. And of course, she lived like 80 years ago. And I also, in my work at the Anne Frank House, oftentimes we worked with stories and we worked with photos of adults who had suffered during she was born before the Second World War, but suffered through the Holocaust. We used the images of individuals, adults, who were killed or who survived the Holocaust. And in my own work at the Anne Frank House, we did an evaluation of how do young people, how do they feel about some of these photos? We have a traveling exhibition that also came to this school. And what we learned is that it's interesting that some of the most powerful photos of adults didn't appeal at all to young people. They just kind of walk right by them. But these are photos of young people who had experienced exclusion, had been attacked for whatever reason. They had been attacked because of their sexuality or gender identity or through their religion or their culture. They were attacked in the street. That young people really gravitated towards that. So one of the main lessons I learned is that young people connect and associate themselves with stories, identify much more easily with the stories of other young people because who are like themselves in many ways. Because when you look at these stories, the story of Anne Frank, a 13 to 15-year-old, when she wrote her diary, and you yourself are about that age, you make that connection. Some of these stories are for all ages. And I think that's one of the main lessons I learned. I also developed a concept there, which goes back to the ancient times as such. It was peer education. So I also learned by implementing peer education that, first of all, 13 to 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds can take on responsible roles in the school. I saw that today here in this school as well, that they just have to be given the opportunity to take on these kinds of roles, these responsible roles. Yes, of course, if somebody's 13 years old or 14-year-old, they're going to make some mistakes, but that's all part of learning, the learning process. You don't have to be perfect. But if you do it 30 times, by the way, you will get pretty good. So it's the power of peer education that young people, Anne Frank, she's done it posthumously. She died many years ago, but through her writing, through her diary, she's able to educate young people about things because of her experiences in her diary. And young people today can educate other young people because they have the power to do that, but they need to be empowered to do that by the schools, by the teachers, by the authorities, giving them that kind of a trust.
So you mentioned how young people can inspire other young people and how young students are able to take up responsibilities themselves. So in that essence, what strategies do you think a school can implement based on these insights?
I've seen that already in the school where this conference that I'm attending here, the MCs were students. And I just want to emphasize that that's not very common. I've been to many conferences in my life, and I've seen this only one or two times, that it's actually the students that take the responsibility for that. So I think it's something that can be, first of all, teachers need to understand that this is possible, that it can be done, that there are good examples out there of how this has been done effectively, that teachers need to take a step back a little bit. That's also a sense of let them do it, let them make the mistakes. So it's that awareness at the school level. The head teacher is really critical at this. The head teacher has to have the sense, oh yes, if there are parents there, it might not be perfect, but they'll be very proud of their students. The teachers will be very proud of their students. So it's something that can be written into school policy. And also it I think should be part of the school culture, that wherever possible, whenever possible, we will allow the students to take an active role, supported by us as the teachers, by us as the authorities. It doesn't mean we step back as teachers and just allow this to happen, but we want to give them support every step of the way so that they can be empowered to do this kind of work. So it's through the policies of the schools, it's through the unwritten rules of the schools, the school culture, that this can happen. And I think it's also important in the curriculum to use examples of young people that have taken a stand, young people that have made a difference. And that's an example, again, of Anne Frank, where she made a difference through her writing. But there's so many young people across the globe that have made a difference, that have taken a stance on a variety of issues. But so students need to know that these examples are out there, that these role models are out there, that other students have made a difference in the planet, and that it's possible. That it's hard to change the entire world, but it starts with small steps. It starts even in your family. It starts in your community. Taking these small steps in your community, this is where you learn. So that also needs to be encouraged. And students need to know that they don't have to change the world overnight, but that can happen in a very slow process, that they can change the environment that they're in. That can mean, if we're talking about inclusive education, helping a student who might be not doing so well, helping a student who might have a certain disability, helping a student who might come from a different religion or might be excluded. That's a real key issue, to help a student who's being excluded. And there are ways that schools can do that as well, to make sure that students are not excluded, to introduce students to other students that they otherwise would not talk to. The anti-bullying campaigns are another way of doing that. So all these are different ways that schools can enact policies and create a school culture where bullying is, you're not going to get rid of it totally, but it's less, that people are aware of it, that people take the steps to prevent it, that the inclusion process can take place in the school.
So, Mr. Barry, how can teachers approach sensitive topics in a classroom environment to their students in a more balanced and careful manner?
I think that's a really critical question, and I appreciate that one. I think that schools across the globe and teachers across the globe are dealing with that. I think the first thing is to realize that teachers are oftentimes doing their best, and sometimes they are very good-willed in what they want to accomplish. I think for teachers it means, it oftentimes entails a little bit of extra training and how to deal with sensitive topics, how to deal with controversial issues. I think that schools and teachers also need to realize that students are not always willing to, there's a certain amount of resistance to talk about these kinds of sensitive topics, depending on their views, depending on their backgrounds, and especially if we're dealing with diverse backgrounds and diverse identities in the classroom, that there can be a certain amount of resistance to talking about these kinds of issues among the students. So it's really a responsibility of the teachers to know who the students are. And so it's really a lot of work, I have to say that as well, for teachers to be able to create that, we talk about a safe space in the classroom. That safe space means an environment where the students don't feel criticized, don't feel ridiculed, where they can express themselves and know that if they express themselves, if they express their concerns, if they express their disagreement with certain issues, which can happen, and it's a good thing if they disagree. You don't want everybody agreeing on everything, right? That they can feel free to do that. Then there are methodologies that teachers can learn, and some of them already know, as to how to promote an environment in the classroom where, for instance, debate is used a lot. Students debating a certain issue. But when you're debating something or when you're discussing something, and you might know this for yourself, and then people who are listening to this podcast, what you're doing is you're preparing your next argument for the most part. You're not really listening to the other argument. You're not really listening to what that person's trying to say. This is just a fallacy that we almost all have. And so there are methodologies that teachers can use in a classroom beyond just saying we should all respect each other and we have to agree to disagree in the classroom, right? But there are methodologies that will help create that kind of environment, an environment that is conducive to active listening. So there are a lot of active listening activities in a classroom that go beyond like a debate methodology where you're arguing with each other or discussing with each other, which kind of puts you in a situation where you have to listen to what others are saying. We have to listen to their arguments without preparing your own argument. And I think it should also be said that it's important with controversial issues, not only to, as a teacher, to present these different arguments from both sides, but have the students do some research. And I think in this day and age, where you have so much misinformation, especially disinformation, there's a little bit of a difference between the two. Disinformation is really closer to propaganda, right? Where people are giving false arguments to promote a certain view or a certain type of propaganda. In this day and age where you have so much propaganda online, so much disinformation online, it's important for students to have these research skills to know where that information that they're finding on the internet, what is reliable information? Why is that reliable information? What is the evidence for that? By putting the power in the hands of students to do some research, finding these different kinds of arguments on all sides of the issue, and coming together and looking at these different kinds of arguments and saying, who is providing that kind of evidence? Are these people independent? Are they reliable? Are they unbiased in the kind of evidence that they're giving? So all these kinds of things can help in promoting that kind of a climate in a classroom where that takes place.
So thank you, Mr. Barry, for sharing your insights and expertise. I believe I speak for everyone when I say these have been very impactful for our school community, and it was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for taking out the time to meet with me.
Thank you for your project that you're doing at the moment, this project-based learning that you're engaged in, because you're influencing lives. And, I think many of us who have a certain privilege, and I think that most of the students here in the school have a certain privilege. I know that I grew up in this, even though I come from a working class background, I have had a great privilege of having gone to the university, the first person in my family to go to the university. We try to pay it forward, as they say, try to help others because of the privilege that we have. And I think it makes us a better person to do that. So I know that you're doing that right now. And I know that many of the students in the school are doing that. So I want to thank you for allowing me to be here.
So it was a pleasure to talk with you. So that's a wrap for this episode. I'll see you in the next episode. Stay curious and keep learning.